call came on a Tuesday, which is the kind of detail you only remember because it was the day I'd just gotten back from a 14-mile ruck march and my boots were still wet when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was my sister-in-law, not my brother, his wife. "We need to talk about the rehearsal dinner," she said, and I already knew from her tone that this wasn't going to be a conversation about seating arrangements. My brother Tyler was getting married in 6 weeks. Big outdoor venue in Savannah, the kind with Spanish moss hanging from live oaks and a white tent that probably cost more than my first car. He'd been with Kayla for 4 years, and I liked her fine. She was organized, drove a sensible car, made my brother eat actual vegetables. I had no complaints about Kayla. What she said next, though, Tyler and I were talking, and we just think we want everyone to feel relaxed, you know? And sometimes when people see a uniform, especially now with everything going on politically, it can make things uncomfortable. Some of Kayla's family are kind of sensitive about. She stopped, started again. "We just think it would be better if you came as yourself, not as, like, a soldier." I stood there in my kitchen in wet socks and said, "I am myself, Kayla. You know what I mean." I did know what she meant. I'd known for a long time what she meant. What my mother meant when she used to tell people I was in school somewhere down south instead of at West Point. What my father meant when he'd say, "She's in the army," the way you might say, "She went through a phase." What Tyler meant all those years ago, sitting at our parents' kitchen table when he said, "I just don't understand why you want to do something like that. You're smart. You could do anything." As if serving wasn't something. As if 12 years, 4 deployments, a combat action badge, and the rank of captain on my collar wasn't something. I told Kayla I'd think about it. I hung up. I sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs were tired from the march, and I stared at the linoleum and I thought, I'm 31 years old. I have led soldiers to places most people can't find on a map. I have made decisions in seconds that I will spend the rest of my life examining, and my family wants me to show up to my brother's wedding looking like I sell insurance. I thought about calling my friend Stevie, Sergeant First Class Stephanie Kowalski, who I'd served with in Germany, who had a way of cutting through things that I'd always admired. But it was late, and I knew what she'd say anyway. She'd said it before. You keep making yourself smaller for people who never had to make themselves anything. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there until the floor got too cold, and then I got up and went to bed. My family is from a small city in central Georgia, the kind of place where everyone knows what church everyone else goes to and who their parents voted for. My father ran a plumbing supply company for 30 years. My mother taught 4th grade. Tyler, 3 years older than me, went to the University of Georgia on a partial scholarship, got a business degree, and came back to manage my father's accounts. He was the one who stayed, the one who showed up for Sunday dinners and drove my parents to their doctor's appointments and coached Little League in the spring. I was the one who left. I left at 18, and I didn't stop leaving for the next 13 years. Georgia to New York for West Point, then Fort Benning, then Germany, then a place I still don't talk about at dinner tables, then Fort Campbell, then a desk assignment in Virginia that nearly drove me out of my mind, then back to Benning as a company commander. I came home for Christmas when I could, and for funerals when I had to, and for my grandmother's 90th birthday, which was also the last time my father had seemed genuinely proud of me, because she'd made him stand next to me for a photo, and he looked at my uniform for a long moment before putting his arm around my shoulder. That was 4 years ago. I don't know exactly when the silence between us calcified into something harder. It wasn't one moment. It was 100 small ones. My mother asking me if I'd met anyone at my base. My father telling a neighbor I worked for the government. Tyler sending me a message after my first deployment that just said, "Glad you're safe." 2 words, like I'd been on a long road trip. Kayla asking me at Christmas 2 years ago if I was still doing the army thing, the same way you'd ask if someone was still doing CrossFit. What I know is that by the time Kayla called me about the rehearsal dinner, I had spent years trying not to take up too much space. Not correcting people when they got my rank wrong, not wearing my uniform to family events unless there was a reason, not talking about my work because it made people uncomfortable, or so I assumed because no one ever asked. I had made myself easier to be around by making myself less. I thought, standing in front of my closet 6 weeks later, about whether I wanted to keep doing that. The morning of Tyler's wedding was warm, the way Savannah is warm in May, which means humid enough that the air feels like something you have to push through. I drove down from Atlanta the day before and stayed in a hotel off the highway, the kind with a complimentary breakfast that consists mostly of waffle makers and sadness. I'd packed 2 outfits. The first was a blue wrap dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, knee-length, appropriate, the kind of thing that would make me invisible in the best possible way. The second was my Army service uniform, the one with the blue infantry cord and the combat action badge and the 4 rows of ribbons I'd accumulated over 12 years, the one with the 2 silver bars on the collar that meant captain, the one I had earned. The morning of the wedding, I tried on the dress first. I stood in front of the hotel mirror and I looked at myself. And I thought, this is a perfectly nice dress. I look like a perfectly nice person. No one will look twice at me, and that is what my family wants, and I am so tired of wanting things that my family doesn't want me to want. Then I took it off. I took my time with the uniform, every piece in its place, the brass polished the night before, the ribbons straight. I checked the mirror 3 times the way my first sergeant taught me to, once for the front, once for the sides, once to look at myself the way a soldier should look, like you mean it. I drove to the venue with the windows down because the AC in my car had been broken since February and I hadn't gotten around to fixing it, which is the kind of thing that happens when you move every 2 years and can't remember which city your mechanic is in. I sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. Then I got out. The venue was called Whitmore Gardens, and it was exactly as beautiful as Kayla had promised in the wedding email she'd sent with a 15-point FAQ and a color-coded timeline. The tent was white. The chairs were white. The flowers were white and green and something blush color that the email had called Dusty Rose. There were 130 guests, most of them people I didn't know. Kayla's family from South Carolina, Tyler's business contacts, couples they've met through their neighborhood association. I walked in from the parking lot, and a woman at the welcome table looked up from her clipboard, and her mouth did a thing that was almost a smile, but not quite, and she said, "Oh, hi," in a tone that could have meant anything. I said, "I'm Tyler's sister, Ivy." "Of course," she said, and handed me a program. I walked down the path toward the tent, and the first thing I noticed was the sound, that particular hush that happens when 130 people are doing light conversation, and then something in the ambient noise shifts and the conversations don't stop but they pause, just slightly, like a recording that hiccups on a frame. People looked. I kept walking. I found my seat. Family, 2nd row, which was a surprise because I'd half expected to be seated somewhere near the back. And I sat down and placed my cover on my knee, and I looked straight ahead at the altar, which was an arch of white roses that Kayla had described in the email as organic and effortful, which I had thought was a contradiction, but had kept that opinion to myself. My mother was in the front row. She turned around at some point and saw me. I watched her face process what she was seeing. It wasn't a dramatic reaction. She didn't gasp or stand up. She just looked at me for a moment, and then she looked away, and I saw her lean toward my father and say something I couldn't hear. My father turned around, too. He looked at me the way I'd seen him look at things he didn't know what to do with. He nodded once and turned back around. That was it. The music started. Kayla came down the aisle on her father's arm, and she was genuinely beautiful. I'll give her that. The kind of beautiful that makes even the most unromantic person in the tent sit up a little straighter. I sat up straight. Tyler was standing at the altar, and when he saw her, he looked like a person who had just been told something wonderful. And despite everything, Despite the wet socks and the phone call and the 14-mile march and the 12 years and all of it, I felt something open up a little in my chest. My brother was happy. That was real. The ceremony was 22 minutes. I know, because I have a habit of timing things. Afterward came the cocktail hour, and the cocktail hour was when it happened. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies, where someone makes a speech and the music swells and everyone cries and hugs. It happened quietly, the way most important things do. I was standing near the bar, not drinking, just standing, holding a glass of water because I needed something to do with my hands, when I became aware of a man about 20 feet away who was looking at me, not in the way people had been looking at me all day, which was the way you look at something you're not sure you're allowed to look at. He was looking at me the way soldiers look at other soldiers. He was in civilian clothes. Dark slacks, blue button down, sleeves rolled to the elbows, gray hair, maybe 60, 65, and on the inside of his wrist, partially visible when he raised his glass, was the tail of a tattoo that I recognized as the kind of thing you get when you're young and in the infantry and you believe you will feel that way forever. He walked over. "Captain," he said, and his voice had that particular flatness that the army puts in a person after enough time. "Yes, sir," I said automatically, because you don't shake that reflex. He looked at my ribbons for a moment. Not casually, the way civilians do, but the way someone reads, parsing each one. "Iraq?" "2 tours," I said. "And Afghanistan?" He nodded. "I did 3 in Vietnam and 2 more places nobody's named a war after yet." He held out his hand. "Bob Sheehan." "I'm Kayla's great uncle." I shook his hand. "Ivy, Tyler's sister." He smiled. Not a big smile, just the kind where the eyes do more work than the mouth. "Good to see you wearing it," he said. I didn't say anything for a moment. Not everyone feels that way today. He looked at me steadily. Anyone who doesn't understand what it costs to wear that uniform doesn't get a vote on when you wear it. We talked for 20 minutes. He'd been an Army Ranger. 2 silver stars. He'd driven from Greenville for the wedding with the hip replacement. That was, in his words, factory recall material. He told me about his daughter, who was a Navy JAG officer in Norfolk. He told me about his own father's funeral, where he'd shown up in uniform and his aunt had pulled him aside and said people might think he was making it about himself. "You know what I told her?" he said. "What?" I said, "Ma'am, I'm wearing this because it's who I am, and if that's a statement, then I'm making it." I looked down at my water glass. I almost wore a dress today. "But you didn't," he said. "No, good." Here is what I want to say about the moment, because I have thought about it many times since. It was not a dramatic intervention. There was no announcement. Nobody called for quiet, and nobody made a speech. What happened was that Bob Sheehan walked back toward a cluster of men and women I hadn't noticed, gathering near the far side of the tent. Older mostly, some younger, men and women in civilian clothes, and he said something to them that I couldn't hear, and then one of them looked over at me. And then another one did. And then, one by one, without any signal I could identify, they stood up straighter. There were 17 of them. I counted later, after I'd had time to be calm about it. 17 veterans at my brother's wedding, most of them Kayla's family, scattered across 4 decades of service and 3 branches of the military. Most of them I would never have known to look at. Bob pointed at me once, and I saw him say something, and then this one woman, 40s, short hair, an Air Force veteran I would later learn named Renata, who'd done 20 years as a crew chief, she raised her glass toward me. And then they all did. 17 people who had never met me, raising their glasses in a tent in Savannah, Georgia, because I had put on a uniform that morning when it would have been easier not to. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to say I cried and make it a nicer story. I didn't. I stood there with my glass of water, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was the particular sensation of being seen by people who understood exactly what they were looking at. My mother saw it happen. She was across the tent talking to someone, and she went quiet. My father saw it too. I sat at the family table for dinner because that's where Kayla had put me, and it was uncomfortable in exactly the way I had expected it to be, and in a few ways I hadn't. My mother sat across from me, and for the first 20 minutes she talked to the woman on her left about hydrangeas, which I understood was her way of managing something she didn't know how to manage. My father ate his salmon and said nothing. Tyler, to his credit, caught my eye once across the table and gave me the particular look that exists only between siblings, the one that means I know, and I'm sorry, and I don't know what to do about it. It was my father who spoke first. He waited until the plates had been cleared and the toasts were done. Tyler's best man gave a funny one. Kayla's maid of honor gave a tearful one. And then he picked up his glass of sweet tea and he looked at me and he said, "I didn't know you had that many medals." It was the most nothing thing he could have said, and it was also, somehow, more than I had expected. "Ribbons," I said. "They're called ribbons. Ribbons." He looked at my chest for a moment. "What's that one?" He pointed vaguely at the row of decorations. "Combat Action Badge," I said. "It means I was in direct contact with the enemy." He was quiet for a moment. "In Iraq?" "Both places." He set down his glass. He didn't say anything for a long time, long enough that my mother stopped talking about hydrangeas and looked at him, and I saw something pass between them that I didn't have a word for. "I didn't know that," he said finally. "That you were in combat." "I know," I said. And here's the thing about that, it was true. He didn't know, not because he hadn't been paying attention, but because I had spent 12 years making myself easier to be around by not saying the harder things. I had protected him from the weight of it. I had protected all of them. I had carried it quietly, in the way the army teaches you to carry things. Because the mission doesn't stop because you're tired, and you don't put your burden down until you find somewhere safe to set it. I had never found somewhere safe to set it. My father looked at his hands. He's 63. He has hands that look like plumbing work, and Georgia Summers, rough and wide and capable. He said, "Your grandfather was in Korea. He never talked about it either." "I know," I said. "You're more like him than I ever told you." I looked at my father across the dinner table in a wedding tent in Savannah, and I thought, 12 years. I thought 4 deployments. I thought 14-mile ruck march on a Tuesday in wet boots. I thought all the things I never said because I was trying not to take up too much space. And then I thought, here we are. "Thank you," I said, "for saying that." He nodded. He picked up his sweet tea. He didn't say anything else, and I didn't need him to. The reception went until 10. I danced once with Bob Sheehan, who moved with the careful dignity of a man working around a factory. Recall hip. He told me I should look into the Army's Transition Assistance Program if I was thinking about a second career, and I told him I wasn't thinking about that yet, and he said, "Good, you still got years left in you," and I believed him. At 9:30, Tyler found me near the edge of the tent where I'd been watching the dancing and enjoying the quiet. He stood next to me and didn't say anything for a minute, which is something we've always been able to do. Then he said, "I should have called you myself. About the uniform thing." That was wrong. "Yes," I said. She was nervous about everything. She wanted everything to go smoothly." "I know." I looked at him. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, which is a thing you notice about people when you don't see them often. There were lines around his eyes that I didn't remember. "Tyler, your wedding went fine. Nobody cared about the uniform except people who were glad it was there." He was quiet for a moment. "Bob Sheehan came and found me during cocktail hour. Told me his great-niece had married into a family that had a captain in it, and I should be proud of my sister." I looked out at the dance floor. "Bob Sheehan is a good man. He told me some things. About what the Combat Action Badge means." "Okay. Ivy." He started again. "You could have told us." I looked at my brother for a long time. He's 34. He coaches Little League. He eats vegetables now. He married a woman who sends color-coded wedding FAQs, and he is genuinely, completely happy in the life he built. You never asked, I said. Not accusingly, just as a fact. He didn't argue with that. He stood there with it. I know, he said. I drove back to Atlanta the next morning. My car's AC was still broken. The highway through South Georgia in May is flat and green and goes on long enough that your mind has room to wander. And my mind wandered through the whole drive, through the ceremony and the cocktail hour and the 17 raised glasses, and my father's hands and Tyler standing at the edge of the tent, looking like someone who had just learned that there were rooms in his sister's life he'd never opened the door to. I thought about all the times I'd made myself smaller, all the Sunday phone calls where I'd said, "Fine, everything's good," without mentioning that I'd spent the week working with soldiers who were quietly drowning, trying to find the right words to pull them back to the surface, all the Christmases where I'd left the hard things in the car. I don't know if I'll stop doing that entirely. The habit is deep. But I know that on a morning in May in Savannah, I stood in a hotel room with two choices, and I chose the one that was true. And I know that 17 strangers raised their glasses to me because of that choice. And my father told me I was like his father, and my brothers stood next to me at the edge of a dance floor and said the words, "I know," in the way that meant something real. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes you don't need a full accounting, the apology, the complete understanding. Sometimes you need one person to look at you and see what you actually are. That is what the uniform did. Not as a statement, not as a provocation, as the simplest possible version of the truth. This is who I am, and I am not going to apologize for it in a white dress on a Tuesday, or on any other day for that matter. I got back to Atlanta at noon. I parked in my lot. I carried my bag upstairs. I set my cover on the hook by the door where it lives. Then I called Stevie. "How'd it go?" she said. "Better than I expected," I said. "Did you wear it?" "I wore it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, good. That was enough. That was exactly enough.